Which delegate to the First Continental Congress attempted to remedy the problems with Great Britain by proposing a brand new form of government? Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we'll be discussing a man named Joseph Galloway. Now, Joseph Galloway was a Pennsylvania delegate and a longtime friend and correspondent of Benjamin Franklin. Now, Galloway went to the First Continental Congress as a moderate, and I'll remind you that most of the people at the First Continental Congress were moderates, and almost none of them were calling for independence. In fact, none of them were vocally calling for independence. There were some radicals who were on the edge from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and New England in general. Connecticut and New Hampshire also had their fingers pointed in that direction, but I will also remind you that the First Continental Congress only lasted about a month, as opposed to the Second Continental Congress, which would essentially last for about 15 years. The First Continental Congress was just a month, and the delegates showed up and they came together to say, what do we do about these taxes? You know, things are getting a little bit out of hand, and we don't want to go to war, because the outbreak of war at Lexington and Concord was still about another 6 months away. This was happening in October of 1774, and it wouldn't be till the following April that war would actually break out. So they're there, and while they're there, the Suffolk Resolves show up. Paul Revere shows up, and he has the Suffolk Resolves, which were written by Dr. Joseph Warren back in Massachusetts. And they look at these, and the Resolves are basically very critical of the government, and they most importantly call for a boycott of British goods. And the result of the First Continental Congress would essentially be what was recommended in the Suffolk Resolves. But when this happened, Galloway, who was a moderate, proposed his plan of union. And Galloway's plan of union is very interesting for several reasons. First of all, it is pretty much a reflection of what had happened 20 years prior at the Albany Congress that Benjamin Franklin had recommended. And the idea was there would be one government, a parliament of the colonies, if you will. And that would have a president general appointed by the king, and it would have a delegate from each of the 13 colonies in British North America, at least the 13 that were participating. It may also have included other colonies, East and West Florida, and the Canadas, which were all also part of Great Britain at the time. They would have also had delegates sent there, and each delegate would be sent for 3 years. And the idea was this body would have the ability to veto any of Parliament's laws. It would not actually make laws or affect the colonists directly. What it would do is simply veto any laws that Parliament might pass that they disagreed with. And this was just a means of protection, a check and balance, if you will, which would later become very common in the United States Constitution. Now, this was discussed and debated, and it was a very close call, but it was outvoted by one state margin, voted down the Galloway plan, and instead they voted for the boycott on British goods. Now, Galloway, after this, he did sign the Continental Association, and he would, unfortunately, leave the First Continental Congress, and although he started as a moderate, as things got more radical, he became more loyalist, and eventually sided with Great Britain, and at the end of the war, did evacuate North America and as a refugee and settle in Great Britain. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jason, how could a loyalist be an American founder? If you're not new here, then you've heard me answer this, but for those of you who have not heard me say it, I have a very broad definition of what American founder includes, and if we're talking about someone who signed one of the 4 major documents of the United States, even if he didn't end up siding with the independent United States, he certainly had a role in creating an independent United States, and therefore, no matter what his beliefs were, his actions determined that he did, in my personal opinion, have an effect on the American founding. And especially since he proposed his Galloway plan was extraordinarily important, because in a way it was closer to the eventual federal government under the Constitution than what these same founders who would vote for independence that he disagreed with, what they would come up with for the Articles of Confederation. And in fact, if looking at it objectively, his plan of union was way more radical than the boycott they actually announced. Now, the boycott was a big deal, and it affected merchants, and a lot of things, and it did, in a fashion, work, because merchants in Great Britain were complaining to the king and Parliament, hey, like, we're losing all this money, like, please, make them stop the boycott. But the plan of union was, hey, he wanted to say, hey, king, let's redo the way government works for colonial America. And while it would have, the object was to keep the colonies a part of Great Britain, because again, the revolutionaries were fighting for what they considered their rights as Englishmen. They considered themselves British, and they were proud to be British because they thought, in a way rightfully, that the British were the freest people in the world because of their rights as Englishmen. And that's what they were fighting for. And the idea that, oh, let's change the government to secure these rights was extremely radical for the time. In a way, a little bit too radical. And that's that, plus the idea that the boycott would work, and essentially would work, they decided to vote it down. So, again, like I said, my definition of founder is very broad compared to what most people might think, but I find Joseph Galloway's story extremely interesting, and it's important to note this conversation because this was a debate at the First Continental Congress, this month-long meeting where the colonists came together for the first time in 9 years since the Stamp Act Congress, and only the second time ever that the multiple colonies had sent their people to meet and discuss how to protest the king. Well, Galloway's participation is essential to know about. So, maybe he's a loyalist, but we definitely had to talk about him. I hope you enjoyed talking about him. I certainly did. If you did, please hit like. Helps me out a lot. And if you're new here, definitely subscribe. I put out videos like this 5 days a week, including, well, additionally, a live one on Saturday where I talk about the articles I wrote this week. So, come join us in the live one on Saturday. Thank you so much for watching. I will be back to you with another founder tomorrow.